Hey guys. Um, so I'm trying out my tech abilities here, which are very limited. And I had to go to the very back bedroom because now we have um, five people in the house, no longer empty nest, and everybody's trying to work from home and do school from home. And I bet you guys are having the same problem. Anyway, so I thought that I would just try. I know I've already posted this PowerPoint, but just to highlight some of the key things about the Cold War that you need to know from this chapter. So, um, when we left off, okay, we had finished World War II, and if you remember, um, right before World War II, Great Depression. So there was this real fear that the United States would sink back into a Great Depression after World War II. Remember, we talked about how everybody contributed by rationing supplies and um, um, gathering up rubber and metal and that sort of thing. So, for all this time during World War II, lots of people had saved money. Now they're wanting to spend. Um, Remember how there were federal laws that were passed to keep workers from striking. So what's going to happen is that following the war, the unions are going to try to help get better wages, and you're going to have strikes. So we get the Taft-Hartley Act that makes the closed shop illegal, which means you can't require people to not join a union to get the job. That is going to weaken the unions because obviously if you're forced to um, um, oh, I'm sorry, let me go back. A closed shop meant that you had to be in the union, okay, to get that job. And of course, if you don't have to, then that's going to weaken the unions. There was a big opposition to unionization, especially in the South and the West, and so the that's going to weaken unions. And then service sector jobs. Service sector means like nowadays it'd be like the people who do your fingernails, do your hair, mechanics. Those are all service painters. Those are all service sector jobs, and those are hard to unionize. Um, all right, so between 1950 and 1970 was a very long economic boom. Um, America's going to grow in population and in the economy. You're going to have a lot of social mobility, and that means that people are able to go up the socioeconomic ladder. Um, and you're going to have things like rock and roll and television and all kinds of new cultural things that are developing. Lots more jobs for women, and that's going to create some tension between whether they should be at home, whether they should be in the career field, out in the job career field. But anyway, so some of the reasons for this prosperity, we were the only nation that still had factories. If you think about Europe, if you've seen any of the World War II movies, all of that fighting took place in Europe, and places got destroyed. So we're the only places that have factories intact. And so when people need to order things, guess where they're going to be made? They're going to be made here. We also were spending tremendously on the military, and that becomes the foundation of the economy. We spent on World War II, and then as soon as or pretty much as soon as World War II is over, we're going to go into the Korean War in 1950. And not only is that spending going to be the basis of the economy, but it's also going to incentivize the high-tech industry. All right, we'll talk about oil in the Middle East for sure, and we'll talk about how America and Europe had to control the oil production. Much different than nowadays. We're having this oil, lots of synthesis right now. Back during this time period, Americans could never imagine that we would be energy independent from the Middle East, and we are now. And so what you're seeing currently is an oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And I saw an article just today where I think it was in Kentucky that gas got down to like 90, below $1 a gallon, which is incredible. All right. Let's see. So we've talked about the Sun Belt. Remember I said the Sun Belt was like that big smiley face at the back, at the bottom of the map of the United States, and populations start to become more fluid. In other words, people are moving. We talked about the Great Migration already, where African Americans move from the South to those jobs in the North. And what we're going to see is the Sun Belt is going to grow. It's going to be the fastest area of growth, and there's a good climate, there's military installations there and technological industries, and that's why people are going to move there. The old industrial areas of the Northeast becomes the Frost Belt, and the Rust Belt is the Midwest, and they're going to have shrinking populations. So you're going to have population shifts, and economic shifts is going to equal political power shifts away from the north and to those other areas. The suburbs are going to be made possible because you're going to have cheap loans from places like the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, and the VA, as well as all that new interstate system that's being built. New highways, new interstate system we'll talk about later. Levittown, definitely need to know this for APUSH purposes. Levittown was one of the first ever suburban tract homes. Tract homes just means that the builder goes in there and builds kind of a standard home, and then all the homes look the same. If you've ever been through a neighborhood where you kind of get lost in the neighborhood because everything starts looking the same, I'm looking at you, Heritage Farms. Yeah, those big neighborhoods, and then they start looking the same and I can't find my way out. So what you're going to also have is white flight, where you're going to have a lot of whites leaving the cities to move out to the suburbs. And there was even something called redlining, which meant that you had to say that you wouldn't sell to you know, black people or Jewish people, trying to keep those suburbs white. The Yalta Conference is really important. This is where the big three sit down to discuss post-World War II, to establish peacekeeping forces, to discuss the governments in Eastern Europe. The big thing that the United States wanted was for the Soviets to join in the war against Japan. And for them to be able to do that, they wanted some land, they wanted some trade concessions, and they wanted some control over some parts of China. They also laid the plans for the United Nations at the Yalta Conference. Now, what's going to happen here? Stalin, can't trust him, right? And so he's going to break most of those pledges that he made at the Yalta Conference. So this is the beginning of the tensions between the United States and the Soviets that really starts the beginning of the Cold War. In fact, Stalin did not even know that the United States had developed the atomic bomb, and we withheld that information from him. So, all right, let's see. The Nuremberg trials were the trials that were held of the German leaders that were responsible for the Holocaust. Many of them were jailed. Some were executed for crimes against humanity. The Soviets, listen, when we talk about rebuilding Germany, if we go back to World War I, okay, post World War I, right, America retreats back into isolationism. Europe is left to fend for itself. Remember the whole Dawes plan, that triangle of money that was really weird, and that whole thing collapses, which allowed for the rise of fascism in Italy and for the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany. And so we didn't want that to happen again. But Stalin, remember we talked about how many Soviet lives were lost in World War II, lost the most amount of lives. They're in no rush to rebuild Germany, since Germany's invaded them twice now in 2 world wars. They don't really care to rebuild Germany. So we wanted to rebuild Germany because we wanted allies against the Soviets because this Cold War had started. So Germany's going to be divided into 4 occupation zones, and what's going to happen is the zones or the spheres that Stalin controls are going to be considered Soviet spheres, and Churchill will give a really famous speech. You can click on it in the PowerPoint here, where he says it's as if an iron curtain has descended on Eastern Europe. If you think about curtains, they're supposed to they block out light. If it's an iron curtain, there's really no light, no freedom, no moving of an iron curtain. So that's representative of the Cold War as well. George Kennan, and I put this as a document on Google Classroom. He was an American diplomat, and he stated that the Soviets intended to expand and that the United States needed to contain that spread with force or with threat of force. Okay, so the Kennan telegram sets up this policy of containment that becomes the foreign policy of the United States. I put in Google Classroom, my favorite analogy is my tuna fish analogy about containment. I love tuna fish. Don't know if anybody else does. Like to put some apple in there, some pecans, mayonnaise. Of course, you gotta have mayonnaise, some boiled eggs. Flavor it up with some cumin, salt, and pepper. Put some fresh apple in there. Gotta put that in there. But if I make up a big, nice, juicy batch of tuna fish, put it in a bowl, stick it in the fridge with no lid, what's going to happen? Anybody who knows that within just a short amount of time, everything in the fridge is going to smell and taste like tuna fish. Now, I like tuna fish, but I don't want my other stuff to taste like or smell like tuna fish. We need a lid on that. So, the refrigerator is the world. Tuna fish is communism. The United States wants to put a lid on that tuna fish. We don't want to get rid of communism in the Soviet Union where it exists, but we sure don't want it to spread. We don't want the world turning to communism. So tuna fish containment. The Truman Doctrine adds on to that containment doctrine. Remember how we had the Monroe Doctrine and then the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine? Well, that is what the Truman Doctrine is to the containment doctrine. So Truman said, listen, if we really don't want communism to spread, we want to contain the tuna fish, then the United States needs to support free people that are trying to resist communism. So that is going to lead us to interfering in places like the first two places, Greece and Turkey, to try to help them fend off communism. The policy of containment was outlined in a document called NSC 68, and that is going to lead to a large peacetime military, because if we want to, if we're going to help people that are resisting communism, we're going to have to use the military to do that, and so we're going to have to build up and maintain a large military force. The Marshall Plan was to rebuild Europe, going to provide food and money, and try to avoid the economic crisis post-World War I that led to the rise of fascism and Nazism and Hitler and all that. We offered that to Eastern Europe, those zones, the spheres that the Soviets controlled. But there was a Soviet-led coup in Czechoslovakia. Anyway, didn't work. We did get the National Security Act, 1947, that locates the Department of Defense at the Pentagon. NATO was established. I really need to know that. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that's 1949. Member nations pledged to support each other if attacked. So this is very similar to what Wilson wanted to do with the League of Nations post-World War I, but was not able to get passed in the Senate. We will reconstruct Japan as well. Douglas MacArthur, remember our Arkansas connection. He was born in Arkansas, and he became the general that was in charge of the governing Japan. Japan cooperated very quickly, democratized very quickly to help end that occupation. Meanwhile, in China, we have a civil war that breaks out. I posted a video about the Korean War that will, if you'll watch that, it will really help you understand what was going on in China and what then happens in Korea and how we get into the Korean War. Chiang Kai-shek led the nationalists against Mao Zedong, the communist. The communists are going to win. The nationalists have to retreat. Meanwhile, the Soviets detonate their first ever atomic bomb. The husband and wife team of the Rosenbergs, they were spies. They were Americans that were working with the Soviets, giving them secrets for the atomic bomb, and they were both executed. Okay. Remember we had a Red Scare post-World War I? Second Red Scare, post-World War II. Red means communism. We're scared of the spread of communism in other places. We're scared of the spread of communism in the United States. So the Loyalty Review Board was created in 1947 to investigate federal employees to see if they were communist. The Dennis versus U.S. case, where the Supreme Court upheld the convictions of communists under the Smith Act,